Welcome back. We're going to continue in our study of creation. We're now going on from days 1, 2, and 3 into day 4. And as the chart would reflect, we now start a new pattern. In the first 3 days, God was creating what I called spaces that now in days 4 through 6, he is going to return to filling. And it's this the nature of this pattern, this back and forth pattern, that lends evidence to the fact that this is something God is doing with purpose, with forethought. It's not random. It's not happening just through nature, as some would say, but there's real purpose behind it, and this chart will begin to show that, starting with days 4, 5, or going to day 4 and going to days 5 and 6 in a minute. Let's start with day 4, and we have a large text of Scripture here. Hopefully everybody can read it on the screen. I'll read it out. Verse 14. Then God said, "Let there be light in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for light in the expanse of heaven, of the heavens, to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Well, now that we're starting to fill spaces, things get very interesting, if they haven't already been for you. Let's take a look at a couple of key words out of this passage. First, expanse again. We've been doing this, from last time, the expanses of earth and heavens and so on. We wanted to understand each time we see this what he's talking about, and we have to look at the context. So in this case, he has objects of light in the expanse of the heavens, and putting them there, he says, to give light on the earth. So I'll ask you a quick question, a little test question here. Of the three heavens, remember what the three stand for? We have atmosphere, outer space, and the throne room of God. Which of these three are we looking at today? Obviously, it has to be, from that chart, you have to understand, well, he's looking at outer space. So even if you couldn't have guessed by the context, and obviously the context didn't make it very hard, but even still, the chart gives you that reinforcement. We know what space we're filling. We're filling the universe, as it were, now, he says, with these objects. And we're told he created a greater and a lesser light, but he doesn't name them. And the reason he doesn't name them, these are the only two things God makes in all that he makes in the first week without naming them. And he doesn't name them, I think, because of what he writes later in Deuteronomy to the nation of Israel. He says, "Beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven, and see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the hosts of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven." His point, of course, is that as you name something and put it up in the sky, and as prominent and as magnificent as stars and the moon and sun are, it's not hard to see mankind beginning to see them as gods. In fact, mankind did that very thing anyway. God just didn't want to encourage it, I think. But he put them there. Going back to the text now, let's look at some other words that are interesting in this text. Specifically, this separate day from night, let them be for light, let them govern, let them give light, and so on. This is interesting because we already know we have light, and darkness for that matter. And as a result, now we have to understand what he means by separating day and night at this point in creation. Remember earlier we saw him separate light and dark, and we said at that time that that was a reference to time. He separated them in time, not physically. Now, though, the text is saying he's separating day and night. Now, day and night were the names that God gave to the periods of light and dark, which allowed for the counting of time. Have I lost anybody? So you have light and dark, then you had day and night as the names given to those light and dark cycles. Now he is separating day and night in a physical way. Whereas earlier it was temporal, it was time, now it is physical. He is giving physical dominion for these two time periods to two objects that he says will govern these time periods. So obviously the moon and the sun become the objects in the sky that govern the periods of night and dark. And in that sense, we're saying God embodies the light into the sun. And ironically, of course, the darkness of night is made less dark by the presence of the moon, which is itself reflecting the light of the sun. So God is doing a series of things here to achieve an outcome for the sake of what he wants to see happen on the planet. But remember, the light and the dark existed before these objects did. So it's not as though they are the cause of light inherently. They have been made to be the cause of light, as God has given them the dominion over it for their period of time. But in a day to come, these things won't exist anymore and we'll still have light. So it is a temporary accommodating of light into an object so that the object can produce something for earth. What is it that God's trying to do? What does he need done through these objects that he couldn't have done if he had just left it the way it was? Well, let's look at how this is working. Here we are, and he put sun and moon around us, but now you're somewhere on that planet, or soon there will be those on this planet, right? In day 6, he'll put men and women on the planet. And he still wants them to count time, so he still wants them to have day and night. Day and night. Before these two objects existed, no matter where you stood on the planet, it was day and then it was night. And then it was day and then it was night. Everyone had day at the same time. Everyone had night at the same time. Everyone had day at the same time. Remember, he just separated them like a big blinking light in the universe. But that's not how he wants it to be. He wants this planet to have periods of night and dark on different sides of the planet. Why? Well, because by the movement of light around the planet, so will heat move around the planet. And by the movement of heat around the planet, so you will have things like wind and seasons, which he just said are part of the reasons why these objects have been created. So what else has just been implied? What has God just done in this day that's not stated, but it's implied by what he's set about to do? Well, he just set the world to rotating. Before this moment, it was a big ball of water and then water and earth, but it was standing still in the heavens and it was getting a big flash of light every 12 hours and then darkness every 12 hours. But that's not the way he wants it to go, because that wouldn't produce the life that we know on earth, the weather patterns and the sunrises and sunsets that God draws in Scripture as metaphor. So he begins rotating us with a fixed object holding all the light and another object reflecting it. You see, the point is that light didn't need these objects, but other reasons needed them. And so he embodies the light into the objects. Haven't lost anybody yet, have I? Okay, let's keep going. Back to our text. A few more words that jump out. This has got to be the most understated sentence in all the Scriptures. When you look out on a starry night and you see you can't do it in a city anymore. So let's pretend you go to a middle of nowhere, because that's what you have to do nowadays, go out in the middle of nowhere where there's no light pollution, and look up at the sky and you see all the stars in the sky and you marvel at that. You have to. Even if you don't believe in God, you're amazed by it. But in the Bible, it gets 5 words. He made the stars also. So here we are floating around, and God said, that's not enough for men, and so he did this. And that he makes a comment in 5 words about, because it goes to show the purpose of his creation was not focused on the outside of this universe. It was focused on the inside, on the earth, that is. The earth is the center of everything God is doing. The stars are there to impress us. And for other reasons, back to our text, he says that they are for signs, for seasons, and for days and years. Now, we've just talked a little about seasons. We'll come back to that. But let's look at all 3. Let's start with separating day and night. We just did. Let's look at signs. The word sign in Hebrew is just the word oth, and it just means an omen or a witness. As in, for example, to bear witness to God's power and glory. He says in Psalm 19, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse, there's that word again, is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their utterances to the ends of the world. In them he has placed a tent for the sun. You see his point, right? The psalmist in poetic language says that though those things in the sky aren't literally talking, they certainly are declaring by their mere existence the power and the glory of a God who has the means to create them. And in that way, these things have become signs to us. Paul says that it is also a witness to God's character and nature. In Romans 1:20, he says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. In my Romans study, we go through this verse with some patience because of all the things we can discover in the creation that says something about God's nature and his attributes. He's obviously a God of power. He's a God of order. He's a God of judgment. He's a God of mercy. He's a God of kindness. You can deconstruct those truths from what you see in the way the world works. And I don't just mean the stars, but in the fact that you get rain or crops come out of the ground, things that God has clearly made out of his love or concern for us. But in the fact that they're so magnificent and there's so much power behind it, it also calls us to reckon with him, to give concern to what he wants, to what he expects. For a God with that much power must certainly be feared. And those are the sorts of things Paul is talking about. And that's why I think God did the creation with stars. And then lastly, it bears witness to his coming judgment. Joel says in 2:30 that when God is close to bringing the final judgments to this earth that he has promised to bring, he will use the stars, the sun, and the moon as warning signs to the earth. Joel 2:30 says, I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. If you've ever gone to an opera or a symphony or some finer production where they give you an intermission and you go to the lobby where they can sell you overpriced drinks and snacks, well, when they want you back in your seat, what do? Someone gets a light switch somewhere and starts flashing it in the lobby. That's a way of saying back to your seats. I think in a very similar way, when God's ready to show the world that his return is nigh and that the judgment is coming, he starts flashing the lights, so to speak. So here's a question that often gets raised at about this point, is particularly from those who don't believe in the literal interpretation of the account of Genesis. And what you'll often hear people ask is, if God made stars on this day, and they're meant to be signs, that is, they're meant to be understood as a sign to the earth, well, we know today that most stars are many, many light years away. Some are millions of light years away, which means that knowing that the speed of light is a constant at 186,000 miles per second, the time it would take light to go from one of those stars to reach our eyeballs on the earth is such a long period of time that it would argue against a literal interpretation of Genesis. Because after all, if he made the stars on day 4, as we just saw, and here we are, if you believe the biblical chronology, a few thousand years later, we still would not see a single star at this point in time because the light's still coming at us and has a long way yet to go. Or that's what they would say. And it is a good question, but it's got a very simple answer. And the answer is, if God is powerful enough to make a star and put it millions of light years away, then he is also powerful enough to take the light from that star and put it on a path to the earth at the same moment, so that he doesn't wait for the light to naturally come to us. He puts the beam in place, and then from that moment it just keeps streaming to us. You follow me? So it doesn't prove it. There's nowhere in the scripture I can go to show that except God's own word, which is to say that he made them for signs, which means self-evidently he intended them to be seeable from the very moment they existed, which means God put everything into place. Much like he did the tree, he took the tree from nothing to fully grown in a day. He took the light and moved it from the star to us in an instant. By the way, if God is the creator of all things, he can break any rule he makes, as he often does, which is why we have the word supernatural. That means God breaking the rules of nature, as only he can do. So God put the light on a path to us so that we would see it, because that was the whole point of it. Then we said for seasons, we talked a little bit about that already. Clearly you can see how the sun and moon contribute to seasons in multiple ways, not just in the fact that by heating one side of the earth and then letting it cool, you create the pressure within the atmosphere to make things like wind happen and ocean currents happen and the like. But it's also just the very fact that we have seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, because of the fact that the earth is positioned in an axis tilt relative to the sun. You knew this in basic grade school science, right? God wanted us to have seasons. Maybe that begs the question, why do we need to have seasons? Well, both the sun and the moon, by the way, produce seasons, not just one of them. In the Psalms, it says, Psalms 104:19, he made the moon for the seasons, and the sun knows the place of its setting. You appoint darkness, and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. And in Ecclesiastes, of course, there's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. If you read through the rest of Ecclesiastes, you find that the writer, Solomon, is saying that in the regularity of life, the seasonal patterns of life that God has created through these mechanisms, you gain a testimony of God's faithfulness, that he brings seasons of rain and seasons of harvest, and this faithfulness is evidence to us that God is working a pattern in life and maintaining it under his control until such a time as those things will stop. Speaking of the sun and moon specifically, we know the sun creates the basic cycles of life. That is, the sun creates produces the energy for plants. It produces the energy for wind. It produces the energy for currents in the sea. The sun is the basic engine of energy on the planet. But the moon provides for monthly cycles which are used to observe the religious patterns of Israel. Israel's religious calendar was based on lunar calendars. So both of those serve to reinforce to the world that God is faithful, and specifically faithful to a plan of redemption, which the lunar cycles are showing through the festivals and feasts that Israel plans. And then finally he said it's for days and years. Now this is sort of interesting because days and years would imply time again, right? Counting of time. Both of these objects are important to that process. You count days, and you notice it said days and years. You count days because we have a moon. Most people don't think in those ways. They think of days as just a way of dividing up a year. But that's not true. The moon rotating once around the earth provides us for what is a monthly cycle of counting days, which then corresponds to a earth rotation around the sun, which gives us counting of years. So it's the movement of these two objects that gives us counting of days and counting of years. Interestingly, again, the new creation has neither of these. Now that begins to beg new questions. Revelation 21 tells us that, and the city has no need of the sun or the moon to shine on it. We read this earlier. For the glory of God has illuminated it, and the lamp is the Lamb. That means we will not count years. If the sun is the basic instrument for counting years, and there's no sun, we're not counting years anymore. Time has no limit. What about months? Well, there's no moon, so you might jump to that conclusion, but wait. Months are counted because we have a tree in the new heavens and new earth, the Bible says, that produces a certain number of leaves, a certain kind of fruit on a monthly basis. Revelation 22:2 says, on either side of the river was a tree of life bearing 12 kinds of fruit, 12 months, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So notice, you can count months, but you're not going to count years. And then you might say, well, I'll know when 12 months are up. Isn't that a year? No, because no one cares. What we care about is that which month are we in so we know which feast or memorial we're going to celebrate. We don't care how many we've had because there's no limit. There's no end. So that tells us something about why we're counting time now. Why do we count years now? Well, it's not because we're counting up like we do with the numbers. It's because we're counting down. That God gave us in this creation the opportunity to count years so that prophetically we could see where we were in a timeline that God gave us through the prophets. And as we see the signs of the times, we begin to appreciate we're getting close to an end. And as we get close to an end, we get that much more serious, we hope, about who we are and who God is and what's our relationship with Him. The point is, even if we don't care about the end of all things, we know our own life is coming to an end. So the counting of years is a countdown to judgment. Once you get past that and you get into the kingdom, there's no judgment, there's no countdown. It's all just endless. But months matter, and months matter because by observing months, there will be in the kingdom a perpetual memorial to Christ's work of redemption even after the fact. On an ongoing basis, we will forevermore remember what Christ did to bring us into that place. We just don't have any need to sum it up into some number of years. All right, so then, day 4, pretty easy on this side of the chart, isn't it? We know what space we created on day 1, and now we're sitting on the opposite side on day 4, and we just have to think, what did we fill? In this case, it's a little tricky because we know that we have a universe we got to fill, and the stars certainly gave us that. But sun and moon, what are they filling? Well, in a roundabout way, they're filling the light and the dark, or you could even say it the other way around. They inhabit the space. So the sun, moon, and stars are what's filling day 1, the space created on day 1, but not just in the simple sense of they all sit in the universe, but in terms of purpose. The sun is embodying the light, and the moon is ruling or governing the dark, while the stars are everything else. The whole of the universe is defined. If you think about it, how do we define the universe? If I said draw a picture of the universe, you just draw a bunch of stars. It defines our understanding of universe.